Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to more Warhammer 40k lore. Now, as I'm sure you're aware by now, the 41st millennium is quite often not a particularly pleasant place to live. And indeed, quite a few worlds are downright nightmarish, inhabited by a wide variety of creatures that are deeply inhospitable to human life. Like, for example, plants, whose natural saliva or nectar would simply melt a human's face directly off their skull. And this particular piece of flora would still be considered fairly harmless by the standards of the planet in general. Not to mention the planets where merely existing is basically hell, like a forge world, for example, where the average human being is nothing more than a replaceable cog in a vast, grinding machine that could not care less about the fate and the comforts of its individual component parts. However, it might shock you to learn that not all worlds are like that. In fact, not even the majority of worlds are like that. The most common planet classification in the Imperium of Man is that of Y-class planets, also known as civilized worlds. And they're a far cry from the usual horrors of the 41st millennium, as, well, they're pretty much like Earth is today. Now, granted, that's taken a turn for the worst in the last 10 to 20 years, but still, civilized worlds are, by most metrics, actually pretty decent places to live, with a standard of living, again, fairly comparable to that of our own current-day Earth civilization. The majority of the population are engaged in various civil or social enterprises, be it running companies, construction, or providing services like banking, etc. to the population, or waging war on one another, as another common feature of civilized worlds is that they are not necessarily a uniform planet, as in unified under a single leader. Well, this is where it gets somewhat complicated. You know how back in the olden days you could have kingdoms that ruled over other kingdoms, or even empires with smaller kingdoms and crowns underneath the overall crown of the emperor? Well, that's kind of how a civilized world also often works, where you have various power blocks and nations and factions like countries scattered across the planet in question that are all under the technical leadership, of course, of the planetary governor, but for all other intents and purposes, internal diplomacy and interactions with the other nations on the planet, they are independent. So far as they're able to pay the imperial tithe, anyways. This is a state of being that is allowed to continue on a civilized world because there isn't really any particularly pressing need to interfere in it. On something like a forge world or an agri world, the potential for planetary war, wiping out production centers, or destroying entire years of crops would of course be an absolutely devastating thing, and would directly interfere with the planet's ability to pay its tithe to the wider Imperium. But a civilized world doesn't really have a specialized produce in the same way that a forge world or an agri world might. Indeed, one could easily argue that one of the primary classifications for a civilized world is 1. Technology level, above that of a feudal world, a medium-sized to small population by imperial standards, so up to maybe 20-odd billion people, tops. In other words, a pre-Hive world civilization. Although, well, see, the thing with Hive worlds is the lore on that one has been vacillating a little bit back and forth, where Hive worlds are supposed to be the only worlds like it, where the hives themselves have been created with technology that is now in essence long lost. But in more recent lore, it has been suggested that entire hives can in fact be constructed. It is obviously going to be an absolutely hilariously enormous undertaking, and fantastically resource intensive, to the point where in all due likelihood it will require significant imports of metals from other planets or mining operations in space, and then what, a few thousand years of active construction work, but you could absolutely build a hive. It would not be economical in any but the most extreme of circumstances, but you theoretically could. So again, 20 billion or so perhaps is probably what you're roughly looking at as a max. As another key defining factor of a civilized world is the fact that it is largely, if not indeed entirely, self-sustained, meaning that it produces all of the food it requires for its own consumption, and even probably exports a fair bit off-world as well, though nothing compared to an agri-world, of course. Similarly, it will also mine and refine its own raw resources, which would probably also preclude the construction of a hive because, oh boy, that is a truly astonishing quantity of material. So there will be a limit to how big a population of such a planet can get before it becomes majoritively dependent upon exports from the wider Imperium. But another definition might be that it is a non-specialized world. Largely, again, because it hasn't really got the infrastructure or the population to expressly specialize. It doesn't have the technology or Adeptus Mechanicus leadership to create a proper forge system. It doesn't have the infrastructure to become a agri world, or perhaps it simply doesn't have the climate, and it doesn't possess one of the other more interesting features of something, say, a tomb world, for example. And so, as far as the wider Imperium is concerned, a civilized world is just a planet. It lives largely independently from the rest of the Imperium, is allowed largely to run its own internal politics and problems and issues and sort things out practically in whatever way it wishes. As there are democratic planets, there are autocratic planets, there are civilized worlds probably run in a top-down fashion, and there are even civilized worlds, or more correctly, a subset of civilized worlds that are run directly by various imperial organizations, be it the Adeptus Administratum, the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Imperial Guard, or Navy. These worlds are planets that are not so specialized as to fall into any other clear distinction, but that have been claimed by these organizations for one purpose or another. The most common purpose is to use it as a sub-classification of civilized world, that being paradise worlds. These planets are also often referred to as garden worlds, and their purpose is exactly as it sounds. It is, in essence, to be a galaxy-sized resort, a pleasure district, a retreat for those of particular privilege, or on occasion, long and honorable service, as is the example of the planet Ropanon, which we saw in Tactica Imperialis. That was a garden world ran by the Adeptus Administratum. Initially, the planet was selected as a data storage planet, which basically means that the Administratum moves in truly titanic server farms to store the unimaginable quantities of bureaucratic paperwork that the Administratum never really wants to delete, but basically never really have to reference, and so it can be stored somewhere over there on the galactic fringes. But more pressingly, probably, was the fact that Rofanon was a beautiful pleasant world. And that allowed the Administratum to shunt over a whole host of privileged personnel to the planet to supervise the data storage operations. Not that they actually required any supervising, but nevertheless, a tremendous number of Administratum personnel found one reason or another to relocate themselves and their entire staff, or those they valued particularly anyways, to Rofanan. Strange coinky-dinky-winky that. Now, the tale of Rofanan is a somewhat tragic one, as first, the traitorous, heretical population rose up against their Administratum overlord and slaughtered them. And then the Imperium gave the planet over to the Tyranids as punishment, so, you know. It's not so beautiful anymore, but still, that is one of the variants of civilized worlds. So, how would life be like on one of these planets? Well, it would actually be, again, fairly reminiscent of life on Earth today. Most people will have a fair degree of liberty and independence, depending upon the nature of the local governmentship, of course. In the case of Rofanan, the entire population were basically turned into slaves to serve their Adeptus Administratum overlords, but, that was a rather special case. Most of the civilian population will be allowed instead to go about their lives in more or less any way they so choose, so long as it provides a service to the planet. In all due likelihood, there are going to be fairly few civilized worlds with a social welfare system quite as evolved as ours. But it could theoretically happen, as again, the only real qualifying requirement here is for the planet to be self-sustained. So if it is a particularly rich planet, or they've come up with some system of government that allows for it to happen, it absolutely could. Speaking of system of governance, I have talked about this on multiple occasions previously, but the various planets within the Imperium are often left to decide how to govern themselves. The exceptions are usually planets that are, again, either highly specialized or are under the rule of a more autocratic imperial governor, or alternatively, planets that are simply parceled up into enormous territories ruled over by a local nobility. These can also on occasion mimic essentially the formations of nations. As we know, certain civilized worlds that are in essence dominated by but a small handful of families that have parceled out truly titanic quantities of lands for themselves, where they live in enormous mega mansions supported by literal villages and towns of basically feudal serfs, but the technology level is too high for it to actually be a feudal world. Indeed, that might even be the evolution of a feudal world. Now, as far as defense goes, as that is a big thing, these planets will usually have a significantly larger imperial presence than a feudal world. On a feudal world, you might simply have the planetary governor and, 200, 300, 400 men armed with las guns or whatever weapons that to the locals would appear to be absolutely magical, because that's all they need. Whereas on a civilized world, odds are pretty good that they've figured out how to accelerate pieces of metal at high speed, shall we say. And so a significantly larger garrison is going to be required, usually in the form of maybe not an Arbites presence. Again, remember, Arbites are actually ridiculously rare, but there will obviously be a local police force, which will be under the theoretical jurisdiction of an Adeptus Arbites officer somewhere. It will also have its own garrison, PDF, but the planetary defense forces are usually not equipped particularly lavishly, nowhere even remotely close to Imperial Guard standards anyways, as remember, the Imperial Guard, relatively speaking, are, well, the absolute elites of the Imperium. They are equipped and trained to a degree that very few planetary defense forces could ever even dream of. But again, with a population in the multiple billions, you are going to need an effective way to, remind the population of their loyalties, should they ever waver. And if the local planetary defense force cannot be trusted to do so, which in most cases they probably can, with the exception of good old-fashioned heresy, etc., then you're going to need an Imperial garrison as well. Now, Imperial garrisons on a properly large scale are very, very rare because the Imperium has far better uses for its fighting men than sitting around babysitting a bunch of, relatively speaking, primitives. So there's probably only going to be maybe a regiment or two under the direct command of the local governor. And speaking of planetary defense forces and the Imperial Guard, whilst life in general on a civilized world is pretty great, honestly, especially by 40k standards, I mean, you're probably not massively oppressed, you probably have the freedom to choose your own vacation, unless the planet has a guild system, in which case, well, you're fucked, I suppose. And you're probably even going to have a decent amount of, well, entertainment, because planets like these are self-sustained, which means that they need to provide some form of funnies for the population to not go completely crazy. We even know this in the rest of the Imperium, as we've seen mentions of literal TV shows being aired between multiple worlds. So there's going to be a lot of stuff to do, a lot of stuff to enjoy, and again, you're not going to be fed into a giant grinder because the gears need to be lubricated with blood or anything like that, which is good. But you might still end up in the Imperial Guard and get dispatched to the ass end of nowhere to be fed piecemeal into a grinder of an entirely different, albeit equally inevitable sort. But your odds of getting conscripted into the Imperial Guard on a civilized world are pretty damn small, really. Civilized worlds are only rated as a medium-level tithe planet, and so it will absolutely be expected to raise Imperial Guard regiments, but not that many and not that often. In most cases as well, Imperial Guard regiments are raised from the cream of the crop of the local planetary defense force. And due to the fairly low amounts of PDF that most of these planets tend to have, you're unlikely to be a part of it. In many cases, it's even going to be voluntary service, or a relatively brief period of mandatory service, where if you don't excel at it, you're extremely unlikely to be chosen for the Imperial Guard. Now, of course, yet again, there are absolutely exceptions to this rule. There might be local circumstances. Vostroya comes to mind. Now, Vostroya is technically classified as a forge world due to its close ties with the Adeptus Mechanicus, but were it not for that, Vostroya would probably be classified as a civilized world, as it has a pretty high level of technology, but a relatively small population of about 10-odd billion people. Vostroya, of course, has the firstborn rule, whereas a punishment after not taking a side during the Horus Heresy, every firstborn son must join the Imperial Guard. And there are undoubtedly going to be various civilized worlds with traditions similar to, if certainly not identical to, this. Imagine, for example, a civilized world that was divided into several different continent-sized nations, constantly vying for dominance over one another. If one of those nations ever managed to actually achieve dominance, there'd probably be a pretty serious tradition of military expertise and exceptionalism on that world, probably leading to a great deal of knowledge about military matters and a large population of soldiers that the new rulers might want to get rid of in order to secure their future rule. Therefore, a tradition to offer extra tithes to the Imperium may be created. Indeed, that could be the reason for why one faction superseded the others in the first place, as it is far from an unheard of tactic for in essence, local warlords to appeal to the Imperium for aid. Basically saying, hey, listen, if you favor me if you give me a little bit of extra aid or resources, or maybe allow me to borrow a regiment of guardsmen, then I will increase the tithe the planet pays in the future. And assuming he manages to reach the correct Adeptus Administratum drone to whisper his promises to, that may very well be accepted, leading then to a tradition of increased military tithes. There are also other potential exceptions, as Civilized world is a little bit of a catch-all for a high-technology, not necessarily specialized planet, which means that you might also have things like, say, a world specialized in the extraction of the world's mineral resources, but not on such a scale that it would require a hive city or a massive population of indentured servants. This might still be a civilized world, but primarily focused on the extraction of resources, either from the planet itself or from nearby asteroid belts, for example. This would then be sort of kind of technically, in a way, a mining world, but also sort of kind of technically not a mining world as well, as it is not yet fully dedicated to the mass extraction of the planet's resources. As we already mentioned, paradise worlds would be another example. Now, on a mining world, you'd probably require the majority of the people to dig, because if it's a mining world and not under the direct supervision of the Adeptus Mechanicus, the excavation methods are probably going to be primitive, at least by, 40k dumper trucks the size of battle titans standards. In the case of something like a garden world, the imperial tithe would yet again probably be downgraded, if anything, as these planets aren't exactly set up for housing mass populations or supporting them. If anything, they're intended to have a fairly small, preferably below revolt levels population, entirely dedicated to servicing whatever group of people has decided to claim it for their own. In that case, a small population is, well, actually a benefit, and thus trying to raise Imperial Guard regiments from what is in essence hotel staffers, not really all that worthwhile, frankly. Or you might have something like a world dedicated, at least in part, to worship or to providing certain financial services or administratum server space, as was the case of Rafan. If Rafan was less beautiful, it might simply just have been a major data hub. And again, raising massed Imperial Guard regiments from population centers like this, it's not really that beneficial, again. If anything, low population worlds like these will be given a low percentage tithe, maybe expected to raise a regiment, a percentage, maybe 2 of the population every 10 years or something like that, to the point where it won't overly affect the population of the planet or its ability to sustain itself in any way, but will still provide a little bit of a trickle. These planets will support maybe a handful of Imperial Guard regiments, maybe a dozen at absolute max, that then get the replacement personnel from that world. On the other hand, you could also easily have a world of worship, something along the lines of a cardinal world, but not on the direct auspices of the ecclesiarchy, with a very, 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 very fanatical population, where imperial service is viewed as an enormous privilege and an honor. These worlds would probably have a much, much higher dedicated population trying to enter into military service and attempting to excel in order to be selected for service in the Imperial Guard during the periods where new regiments or reinforcements are levied from the world. So, yeah, beyond the ever-present danger of getting recruited, life on a civilized world, life on the majority of worlds, in fact, as again, Y-class planets are the most common in the Imperium, is actually pretty decent. You've got a television, you've got your own apartment, more than many can brag about today in our economy, and you've probably got a fair degree of freedom. You might even live in something that resembles a democracy, one with forced military service on occasion from an uncaring and far larger Imperium, sure, but otherwise, it's pretty nice. You're probably not going to have quite the excess of material wealth that we have, as if a civilized world has a significant surplus of something, be it food or minerals, etc., that will probably be sent out into the wider Imperium, bearing you in mind yet again that for the Imperium, the surplus produce of a single planet isn't actually that big of a deal. That's why there are dedicated mining worlds where the Imperium strips away the very mantle of entire planets. So, the casual mineral resources of a single planet is... It's nice, but it's not something the Imperium will fall without. However, Imperial governors too, of course, are ambitious creatures. And the fate of a civilized world will probably largely depend upon who is currently governing it. If it is governed by an individual with ambitions of grandeur to attempt to elevate his status in imperial politics, he may very well volunteer his world to provide additional tithes, be it agricultural produce or mineral resources, or increased tithes of soldiers. In these cases, liberties amongst the civilian populace may often be the first on the chopping block. Various creature comforts sacrificed to increase productivity. Food rationing being enforced, for example, to make sure that the planet has more agricultural produce to export, etc., etc. But that is only in the case of, again, rather ambitious imperial governors. The fact is that if the average citizen of a civilized world is living a pretty good life, the imperial governor is living in absolute fucking opulence. He has a palace in the sky, in essence, and all the pleasure slaves he could ever possibly want or desire. Not to mention access to the rest of the Imperium's entertainment as well. In all due likelihood, unless it is a particularly driven individual, he's probably just going to be another fat, selfish noble, with no greater ambition than to secure for himself the tastiest morsels, the prettiest slave girls, and the softest sponges. So, the next time you're thinking about how awful it would be to live in the 41st millennium, do bear in mind that it doesn't necessarily have to be hell. Indeed, life on the majority of civilized planets is pretty okay, fairly tolerable, although do bear in mind that Talan, the desert world that is covered in nothing but sand and dead rock after the heretic legions virus bombed it during the Horus Heresy, it too is considered a civilized world. So, I guess as long as you're a fan of Lawrence of Arabia, it's not too bad. Until next time, I've been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.